So that's called unmerited favor, isn't it? And we're going to find that, as we looked last week, that these two sons that were born, the one Phares is going to wind up directly in the lineage of Christ, and he's going to play his descendants are going to play a role in the history of the children of Israel that we're going to see this morning. But before we get to verse 24, I kind of want to do a brief review, and I'm going to do it off this note that I made here, where I kind of laid out who these people are and surrounding some of these events that's going on. One of the things we find that is that in the lineage of Jesus Christ came through Leah. And from Leah came Judah, and Judah went down there and he married into the Canaanites. And so we find that he met this Canaanite man, and anyway, he married into the Canaanites, a woman and so we find that while he was down there, he took a wife for his oldest son, And he had three sons, Onan, and Selah. And so we find that he took Tamar, the women of Canaanite, to be the wife of And one of the things that we learned about is that in verse 7 of chapter 38, and Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord slew him. And so we find it doesn't tell us what the wickedness was, but whatever it was, it says the Lord slew him. And so we find that she was to be the wife of Onan, as was the custom back then in practice, that seed must be raised up to the one that's deceased, or the brother that's deceased. And so we find that Onan was supposed to become her husband, and he did, but the thing is, there was no seed raised up. And so in verse 10, we find the thing which he did displeased the Lord, and the Lord slew him. So we find that these two were taken out of the picture by the Lord. We go on to find out that there was a younger son, Shalib, and he was to marry Tamar when he was to be grown. Well, come to find out that didn't happen, and Jacob had kind of forgot about it. He kind of blew it off. Well, we find that as we've already studied, the importance of raising children and raising up a lineage was very prominent back then. And we're going to find some of these things as we come over into the book of Leviticus and into the customs and laws of Moses. These things are going to bleed over into it. And it's kind of interesting about this, because you find that we're not under a law yet. We're still dealing in the patriarchal period, so God has already started establishing some practices that are going to bleed over into the law. And so we find that God slew her, he slew Onan, and Judah told Tamar to remain in her father's house till the young son got grown. Well, what happens is we find that Tamar, as we studied last week, is going to play the harlot. She covered her face in verse 15. Then, of course, Judah now is going to join himself to her and make some promises there, a kid goat. And she, in turn, got a hold of his ideas, we see it. Don't know if it was real identity theft, but he surrendered his identity to her when you read down here in verse 18. And he said, what pledge shall I give thee? And she said, thy signet, thy bracelet, and thy staff, and he gave it to her. A lot of bad things went on this, a lot of poor judgment went on in all of this, didn't it? Daniel, would you surrender all your identity to somebody? That ain't good, is it? When he surrendered that signet, you may as well say he gave her his driver's license, didn't he? When he surrendered that bracelet, you may as well say that's the engraved watch with his name on the back of it, maybe saying happy anniversary or happy birthday, right? And his staff was an important work tool that was identified with him. So, he turned over his identity to her. And so we find that in the course of time, we're going to find that Judah is going to find out that she's going to be expecting children. I'm going to kind of pick up there in verse 24. Out of these children, Pharez and Zerah's born. It's kind of interesting about their birth. They kind of wrestled in the womb, didn't they, like Jacob and Esau did. And we're going to find some other things that's very interesting about this. As we said before, we turned last week to Matthew chapter 1 and verse 3. Pharez is going to wind up directly in the lineage of Christ, and Tamar is mentioned there too. So it was God's plan. And when you look at this, you would think God would have said, enough. I'm tired of working with these people. But that's God's grace, isn't it? That's God's grace. He knew they were living under imperfect systems and under imperfect ways, and his plan was to bring Christ into the world to reconcile man back to God. So this is what has led man to ever since the fall in the garden. It's sin, isn't it? It's sin. And so we find that it came to pass in verse 24 of chapter 38, about 3 months after that it was told Judah, saying, Tamar, thy daughter-in-law, hath played the harlot. And also, behold, she is with child by whoredom. And Judah said, bring her forward, and let her be burnt. Now this was a practice that was in that culture at this time, but we're going to notice too, this practice is also brought over in the law of Moses in Leviticus chapter 20 and verse 14. If you want to mark it and turn it there, about being burnt. And there's some discussion on what this burnt means here. One discussion has to do with, and it's the one that I lean more toward, that they actually burned them at the stake. We know that when sin took place a lot of times, they utterly destroyed it, and they burned everything you had. A second thought is that she was burnt with a type of mark on the forehead or on the cheek that identified her as a type of harlot. Now when you go back and look at this in more detail, and you look at the history of it, when he says she's going to be burnt, the conclusion that I came to was it means that she's going to be burnt. Okay? That means set afire. Okay? And we know they did those practices back then. And you know something about Judah here? And you know, it's kind of like what was going on when Paul wrote the letter to the church at Rome in Romans chapter 2. Now here Judah is guilty of the sin also, but he doesn't think anybody knows about it, so when it's identified to him, well, it's Tamar, let her be burnt. You see, if it's me, it's okay, but if it's somebody else, it ain't okay. You see that picture there? And this is what Paul was talking about here in Romans chapter 2 when he wrote this. Romans chapter 2 and verse 1 talking about the Jews who condemn sin in others, but do likewise themselves. Therefore thou art inexcusable, O man, Romans 2:1. Whosoever thou art that judgest, for wherewith thou judgest, thou condemnest thyself, for thou that judgest doest the same thing. So you know, it's kind of like David, you know, and as we get over farther along in the history of Israel, David had Uriah the Hittite, Bathsheba's husband, killed. Well, Nathan comes to him and said, a parable about the rich man taking the only ewe lamb the poor man had and fed him to his feast. And David got very wrath and upset and mad. Let him be. And then, what did Nathan tell David? You're the man, David. Kind of a rude awakening, isn't it? Kind of a rude awakening. And so we find that he says, let her be burnt. And we find that Judah, in verse 25, and when she was brought forward, she sent to her father-in-law, saying, by the man whose these are, I am with child, she said. Discern, I pray thee, whose are these, the signet, the bracelet, and the staff. Wow. Now, that's hard to refute, isn't it, Brother Colin, when they got your identity, isn't it? Is that you? Your signet is like your picture on a driver's license. That's what they seal stuff with. So it was unique to that individual, wasn't it? The jewelry was unique to that particular individual. And the staff would be unique to that particular individual. It would have certain markings and inscriptions and things like that on it that identified that individual. And it had to be that way because can you imagine at the sheep market when they had all these sheep and goats there, there's no telling how many staffs would be laying there or hanging there, would they? That's how we identified, didn't you? So it was unique. And so we find that his sin is being exposed. And Judah acknowledged them and said, she hath been more righteous than I. You know, he recognized his sin, didn't he? She's been more righteous than I.
He failed on his part to give it to his son.
He did.
Shelah.
Yeah.
He promised to do it.
Right.
But he didn't do it. So then he came to an acknowledgement of sin. In the fact that I may be the cause of her doing what she did.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And Judah acknowledged that because I gave her not to Selah, my son, and he knew her not no more. So there you are.
He decided he'd straighten up.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
get out of that path.
Yeah. Yeah. And you know what's interesting about this, and I'm just going to turn over to Genesis chapter 37, verse 32. You know, Judah was a part of the thing that had went on with Joseph, wasn't he? About presenting the coat back to Isaac, their father. In Genesis chapter 37, verse 32, and they sent the coat of many colors, and they brought it to their father and said, this have we found. Know not now whether it be thy son's coat or no. So they knew what it was, didn't they? So he'd been involved in some manipulation and underlying scheming plans too. Now I'm going to tell you what some of the Jewish writers say about this verse here. They tie it back into this over here in verse 26. They're saying that it was actually Judah that did the talking there when they came. Now the Bible does not say that. I'm just relating that as a piece of information. We know he was involved in it, but to what extent we don't know because it says they said. But when you go to some of the writings of the Jewish historians, you'll find that they refer it back to Judah.
My verse 26 actually says, so Judah said.
Doing that?
My verse 26 actually says, so Judah said to his brothers.
Oh, does it? Okay. Yeah, and that's up there about when they were figuring out what to do with it. What profit is it if we slay our brother and conceal his blood? So he's involved in this thing. So, to what extent we don't know, but we do know the Bible teaches us that your sins will find you out. And so this is what's happening here with him here in verse 26. And so we find it came to pass in the time of her travail that behold, twins were in her womb. So this sounds kind of like, the twin, Jacob and Esau, doesn't it? They were twins in their womb. And so we're going to have twins coming here. It's going to be kind of an interesting story. There seems to be a little bit of struggle here between these two. Because what we're going to find is it came to pass when she travailed that the one put out his hand, and the midwife took it and bound upon his hand a scarlet thread. There she tied a scarlet thread around his hand. See, this one is the first one out. Well, look what happened. And it came to pass, as he drew back his hand, that behold, his brother came out. So, there seems to be a little bit of turmoil going on here within these children, just like it was with Jacob and Esau. And she said, how hast thou broken forth? Wait a minute. This breach be upon thee. Therefore his name was called Pharez, and afterward came out his brother that had the scarlet thread upon his hand, and his name was Zarez. So Pharez officially came out first. And so this is the one that's going to receive the inheritance of the promise of the seed coming through Jesus Christ. And as I said, these people are going to play a role in the history of Israel down through the annals of time. 1 Chronicles chapter 2 and verse 5. They're mentioned. If I can turn here. 1 Chronicles chapter 2 and verse 5. here we have the sons of Israel and the prosperity of Judah. And if you notice here, these are the sons of Israel. He talks about Reuben and Simeon and Levi and Judah and Issachar, Zebulun, Dan, Joseph, Benjamin, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. And it goes on to give us first the sons of Judah. That was and Onan and Selah, which we had talked about. Which three were born unto him of the daughter of Shua the Canaanite, and we talked about that. And the firstborn of Judah was evil in the sight of the Lord, and he slew him, and we talked about that. And Tamar, his daughter-in-law, bare him Pharez and Zerah, and all the sons of Judah were 5. And so it talks about the sons of Pharez, Hezron, and Hamul. So here we found them still being mentioned as an important part of the lineage of Jesus Christ. 1 Chronicles 27. 1 Chronicles 27. And here we have them mentioned as part of the captains over the several tribes. And it says here they were the chief of all the captains. And so we find in David's time these people playing an important role in the history of Israel. Now the children of Israel, after their number to wit, the chief fathers and captains of thousands and hundreds, and their officers that served the king in any manner of the course which came in and went out month by month throughout all the months of the year, every course were 24,000. Of course, over the first course for the first month was Joshua-Shabbim, the son of Zabdiel, and his course was 24,000. Of the children of Perez was the chief of all the captains of the host for the first month. So we find them playing an important part in the rulership and oversight of the children of Israel. And I'm not going to go into too much more detail on that. But in Nehemiah's time, we find in Nehemiah chapter 11 and verse 4, as it talks about the rulers of the people. This is about 445 BC if we date this. So this is some provided this was wrote in somewhere around 1729 BC. So we're looking at about 1,000 years has passed, and we still find these people playing a role here in this with Jerusalem and Nehemiah, them coming back, rebuilding. And it talks about here in verse 4 about the children of Perez was a part of this. So we're going to find that they were in the history and lineage of Israel hard on, and they were active in that lineage. And so we find we come to the close of the story and history of Judah. It's one of those kind of Bible stories that kind of leaves you wondering and in awe, but you have to stop and think about what was going on here, that God had promised that the seed was going to come through woman, and in spite of what man did, God was going to make sure his promise was sure. And so we find that the story of Judah, about how he didn't deserve favor, did he? But God's grace was still poured out, wasn't it? It's kind of like what you see in Jesus Christ, isn't it? Did man deserve that favor? But in God's grace, he said yes. Got to give the opportunity for man to be reconciled back to Jesus Christ. So, any of you brethren have anything on that you'd like to add to or mention about that? Well, we're going to shift gears now, and we're going to go back to Joseph in chapter 39. And this is where we're going to spend a lot of time about Joseph, because he is very prominent in the history of the children of Israel. And we all know the story because we covered it in a prior lesson here a few weeks ago. Joseph was a young man, 17 years old, and we find that his heart was, he was faithful to God, but we find that he was one that had a job and occupation to do, so he was a worker type. What we find though was, the big story about him is his brothers were very jealous of him because his father had made him a coat of many colors. And we talked about sometimes when you have children, you have to be careful not to play parental favorite. So that was one of the marks against him why his brothers hated him. Another mark was he had begun to dream dreams. And Jacob, he was kind of in awe of it because he had those dreams and things. So in the back of his mind, he was wondering that, Joseph must have some special purpose or plan in mind. So he told his brothers about what he was dreaming, and in the end, he told them, really what this is, you're going to serve me. That didn't go over good. So we find that Joseph, to just kind of give a quick summation, was sold to a band of Ishmaelites, traders, went down into Egypt, and we're going to pick up to where he is bought as a slave, and he's going to be very successful. But is it going to be without problems? Is it going to be without trials? Is his success going to be without having to undergo things and temptation? No. But God was with him. And when you look at it, even though Joseph was in bondage, when you go here and read this, because of his actions and his attitude and God blessing him, he was actually the free man. And yet he was a servant in Potiphar's house, was thrown in jail. He got thrown in jail, and then while he was in there, he was such an honorable, honest person, his character was upright, he ran the place. And that's amazing, isn't it? And we continue on with the story about the chief butler, the chief baker, and it was not without trials and tribulations, him trying to do right, was it? And that's a powerful story in itself, and we're going to see that Joseph, he had to withstand these things, didn't he? And so we find chapter 39, and I'm going to read a few verses here. And Joseph was brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian brought him of the hands of the Ishmaelites, which had brought him down there. And the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man, and he was in the house of his master the Egyptian. Now, that says a whole lot right there, doesn't it? Just that second verse alone says a whole lot. But look at the conditions that he was under when he went down there. He was sold to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. So, Potiphar was a high-ranking officer in this if he was captain of the guards of Pharaoh, okay? Some have tied him back in that not only was he captain of the guards, but he was also the chief executioner officer in charge. And I'm just going to throw that in there again as a side note. So Potiphar was a very powerful man down here in Egypt. And so we find that he's the one that had purchased Joseph. And in verse 2, right off the bat, what does it tell us? And the Lord was with Joseph. Can you go wrong that way? And the Lord was with Joseph. It's kind of like the Lord was with Noah, wasn't it? The Lord was with Isaac. The Lord was with Jacob, one of the patriarchs, and now the Lord is with Joseph. And, we're going to find that this was going to be a very important point in the history of Israel, because him being down there in Egypt, what's he going to wind up doing? He's going to wind up saving Israel, isn't he? It's amazing, isn't it, when you look at this story, Jeremy?
And not only does he feed them with the grain, his own family and probably others, but also they end up moving down there.
Yeah.
Getting land or favor and things like that.
And Goshen, and it said it was a prime land.
Right.
Yeah, got the prime land. They didn't get just any land. They got Goshen, and it talked about it being prime. So it was a land that was rich, so you could go there and farm and plant grain and things of that nature. So, but the Lord was with him, and his master saw, verse 3, that the Lord was with him and that the Lord made all that he had to prosper in his hand. Now, you know, when we look at that, when we look at the thought pattern here of Pharaoh and Egypt and idolatry and stuff like that, when it says that, the master could see that this man was special because all he did what?
Blessed.
Prospered, didn't he?
Yeah, he blessed him.
He blessed it. And you know, Potiphar could see that. Now, whether he ever acknowledged the Lord of heaven or not, it doesn't say. But he knew there was something special and unique about Joseph because of the prosperity that was going on with him. And so we find that Joseph found grace in his sight and served him, and he made him overseer over his house and put all that he had into his hands. So already we see Joseph prospering. You know, Joseph is not a prime minister yet in Egypt, but he's well on his way, isn't he? This captain of the guard, Potiphar, says, trusted him enough, he just let him run the whole thing. And that says a whole lot about his character, doesn't it? Can you imagine in your household turning an outsider over that has had difficulty in life already, being sold as a slave, and then you're going to turn the whole operation over to him? You're going to have some strong conviction about this individual's character, aren't you? And so we find that this was put forth, and it came to pass from the time that he had made him overseer in his house and over all he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. You know, I'm going to tell you something. There's a powerful lesson right here about God blessing those that strive to do right. And not only does he bless those that strive to do right, he blesses those that are round about him, that they're involved in. It's a very powerful lesson. You know, when you think about it, we'll kind of tie it in today. This country was blessed greatly and abundantly by the Lord. There's no doubt. Why? What went on here? What happened? Well, when you go back and look, the restoration period took place here, didn't it? The church being restored here in this country. And then what happened next? From this country, the gospel has been taken out into the whole world, hasn't it? Well, God prospered this country because of Christians. And truly on our money, when it says, in God we trust, that's a very true statement. But it's limited to those that have actually made that happen in this country. Jeremy?
Even if you look at 1 Chronicles 13:14, 1 Chronicles chapter 13, verse 14. Basically, the ark of the Lord remained with the family of Obed-Edom in his house for 3 months, and the Lord blessed his household and everything he had. So, what I'm leading with that is it's not some magical thing or special amulet. It's the presence of God. And if you have God with you, his presence, then you're going to be taken care of.
Yeah.
Here on the earth, but also eternal.
Yeah, and it's amazing, you know, and that's a principle that the writer of Proverbs laid down when he said, righteousness, and the word righteous simply means doing that which is right exalts a nation. But sin is a reproach unto any people. That's kind of a generic term, isn't it? Striving to do that which is right. Well, what you have to ask yourself a question, and why politicians and all want to dodge it, is because you have to ask yourself a question, where do you find righteousness? Is it in everybody's eyes, or is there a standard? Well, there's a standard. That principle is laid down in the Bible. These things are principles and laws that are laid down. That righteousness exalts a nation. It didn't say a particular nation. It says any nation that strives to do right, righteousness exalts it. It's blessed. But what happens to sin? Sin creates chaos. Sin creates discord. Sin creates bitterness. Sin creates hatred. And so what happens? Well, if you're not exalted, you're cast down, aren't you? And that's what he's saying there. And so we find there's a powerful lesson here when we read this about Joseph and about him being blessed. Didn't say it wasn't going to be without trials and tribulations, did it? No. It's going to have its own trials and tribulations, that's for sure. We're going to see another Bible principle laid down here shortly, okay, about these things. But we can see already the plan of God as it comes over in the New Testament. A lot of these principles and thoughts are being carried over into what we have today. Still a true statement. And it came to pass from the time that he had made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessings of the Lord was upon all that he had in his house and in the field. And as was mentioned, it's looking at temporal blessings here, isn't it? You can apply the spiritual application of this and look at the blessings that we have for doing that which is right. It's over and abundant, and by us doing that which is right, it carries a light out into the world, you see. So you can say the world is blessed because of the light. Now, whether they see the light or whether they accept the light, that's another story. But that's who we are. We are the Josephs, if you will, of the world, aren't we? The church. And so we find and he left all that he had in Joseph's hands, and he knew not all he had, save the bread. He had such an abundance, he didn't know how much he had. He didn't know how much he had. All he knew is there's plenty of bread in the house to eat, and look at all this. But you know, the devil wasn't going to let that blessing stand, was he? Remember, we often forget as we look at these Bible narratives that were penned by Moses for our learning, that we shouldn't lust after things we lusted. There's another factor played in all of this. And that's what we have to remember. A lot of times it's easy to get caught up in the narrative and think, well, why did God let this happen? What's going on here? Well, you got to think about something else happening here. And we brought this out, I think, last week. The devil is trying to thwart Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15. He's trying to stop that plan. He doesn't want that seed coming to the earth. So we're going to find he's going to insert Potiphar's wife, isn't he, into the plan, or his plan. And notice what it says here. And it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph, and she said, Lie with me. And he refused and said unto his master's wife, Behold, my master wotteth not what is with me in this house, and he hath committed all that he had in my hands. There is none greater in his house than I. Neither hath he kept back anything from me, because thou art his wife. How can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? Now, that's a powerful lesson in that to learn today. Let's back up to Genesis chapter 37. How old was Joseph when all this started? Well, we know when it started with his brethren, he was about 17 years old. So he was a young man, wasn't he? He was what we call in his late teens, wasn't he? Really, by our standards, we don't consider anybody grown till 21, but back in this period of time, by the time you got to be 14, 15 years old, you may be the chief sheep herder. Okay? So, Joseph was basically grown on the verge of being a grown man at 17 years old. Well, now you come over here and you find this event starting to take place with this young man. Here he is in Potiphar's house. He's got all this going on, all the blessings going on, but notice Joseph is adhering to what? A principle of righteousness, isn't he? Now, you know, it'd be real easy to be in a strange place. And you down there like that, he could have thought, well, who would know? Now, the Jewish side of this says that Potiphar's wife was a very beautiful woman, okay? I don't know, I wasn't there, okay? I'm getting old, but I ain't that old, okay? So here you got this woman throwing herself at you. Now, I'm just looking at it on a more modern level, okay? And what does Joseph do? What does he say? He said, I can't do this, son. My master has blessed me and put me over all this, and I just can't do this great wickedness and sin against God. So I can't do this. Well, standing for right a lot of times brings about consequences. And a lot of times these consequences are not very pleasant. And so we find that this continued on. And it came to pass, verse 10, as she spake to Joseph day by day, that he hearkened not unto her to lie by her or with her. And so we find that Joseph said no. But look what's going to happen. And it came to pass that Joseph went into the house to do his business, and there was none of the men with the house there within. And she caught him by the garment, saying, Lie with me. He left his garment in her hand, and fled and got him out. He had such conviction in his heart and in his mind that he just was not going to do it. And in this case, he literally ran. He ran out of his coat, Brother Griffin. She had a hold of it. He ran out. You know, he could have said, well, maybe it'll be all right this one time. Nobody's going to know I'm down here in Egypt. Well, what would that have? What would have happened with that? He stood his ground, didn't he? And he fled. You know, we're going to find this too has a principle, and you know that's something that we didn't look at. Like I say, if we went back and started in Genesis chapter 1, we've been looking at types and shadows, Brother Brown. You know what we could look at? We could go back to Genesis chapter 1 and see what is brought over into what we have as a New Testament in principle and plan. And we haven't even done that. We're doing a little bit of it this morning. So there's all kind of directions we can go in a study like this and still not cover it all. Now what I'm going to do here, I'm going to turn over to 1 Corinthians. I just thought about it. Won't come to me now. It's over here somewhere. Oh, there it is. 1 Corinthians chapter 6. I'm going to start at verse 16. This is probably where we'll stop. See if we don't have on good account, if we have to flee fornication, that we have a biblical example to run, Brother Griffin. Let's see what it says here. What? Know ye not that he which is joined to a harlot is one body? For the two, saith he, shall be one flesh. But he that is joined unto the Lord is one spirit. Two words here. Watch this. Flee fornication, period. What's the word flee mean? Run. Run from it. Do I have a biblical example of someone running from it? Let's turn back over to Genesis chapter 39. And he fled. And he got him out. He got out there, didn't he? So, you know, we find that this is a principle and thought carried over into the New Testament that started many years ago. And looks like I done got off on a different tangent, because in the book this morning, I'd like to run you a copy. I've got another one of those types and shadows of Joseph being like Christ sheets of hand out. Okay? We'll do that next week, because I'm going to stop right here. Okay? And it's something to ponder on when you look at these things. What would we find if we went back and looked at it from that standpoint of what is carried over from this into the New Testament that we still have today? You know, it's kind of interesting, isn't it, when you stop and think about it. And I'm going to stop there, and I guess we'll pick up that verse 12 next week, and we'll get ready for the worship.